Before we begin, I want to make something very clear. This isn't a political documentary. It isn't about choosing sides or telling who was wrong or right. It is simply a story of how one country became two completely different worlds using publicly available historical records, books and speeches and records. Now, with that out of the way, let's begin. Now, just imagine yourself having a brother. The two of you grow up together, you speak the same languages, you eat the same food, you celebrate the same holidays, and everything about your lives are almost identical. Then, one day, somebody draws a line straight across your country, and just like that, the two of you are separated. You never see each other again. Then, years pass, then decades, and more than 70 years later, one of you is living in one of the most richest and most technologically advanced countries in the world today, and the other is living in one of the most isolated and secretive countries on earth right now. Same people, same history, same culture, but completely different lives. How does something like that even happen in the first place? Well, that is the story of North Korea and South Korea. So in this documentary, we are going to uncover how one war, one border, and one decade of completely different decisions turned one nation into two completely different worlds, because this isn't just a story about Korea. It is a story about how history can completely change the lives of ordinary people or the lives of millions of ordinary people. So let's go back to the beginning so we can understand how everything started. You see, long before there was ever North Korea or South Korea, there was simply just Korea. One country, one people, one language, one culture. And for centuries, Koreans lived together as one nation. And just like every other country, they had their own kings, their own traditions, and their own way of living life. But in 1910, everything changed because Japan took control over Korea, due to wars and stuff. And for the next 35 years, Korea was no longer free. The Korean language was pushed aside, and many Koreans were forced to adapt Japanese names, and the country's resources were used to support Japan's growing empire. Then World War II came, and in 1945, Japan lost the war. And for millions of Koreans, this should have been the perfect moment to finally get their country back. But instead, something unexpected happened. You see, as Japan surrendered, two powerful nations entered Korea at the same time. The Soviet Union entered from the north, and the United States entered from the south. And neither of those countries wanted the other to control the entire country. So they came up with what they believe was going to be a temporary solution. They drew a line straight across Korea, the 38th parallel, and everything north on that line would be controlled by the Soviet Union, and everything south on that line would be controlled by the United States. And at that time, almost nobody imagined that one line would change millions of lives forever today. And it wasn't meant to be the birth of two, countries. It was never meant to be the birth of two separate countries. It was only supposed to be a temporary solution. But temporary always have a funny way of becoming permanent. And before long, that simple line would become one of the most heavily guarded borders on earth today. But there was a problem. That line on the map didn't actually solve anything. It only delayed the real problem. You see, the Soviet Union and the United States had two completely different ideas of how Korea should be governed. So instead of helping Korea become one country again, two separate governments were actually created. One in the north and one in the south. And here's the strange part. Both of them actually believed they were the true government of all of Korea. Neither side accepted the other. And as you probably imagine, that was never going to end peacefully, because in 1950 everything exploded. War broke out. You see, North Korean forces crossed into the borders of the south. They invaded the south, and within days, you already know what happened. Cities were falling apart, families were running for their lives, and neighbors who had lived together, their entire lives and for generations suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a war that they never asked for. And quickly, the fighting grew far bigger than just Korea, because the United States and other countries joined the southern part of Korea, and countries like China also entered the war on the side of the north, meaning China joined the war on the side of the north. They were supporting the north side of Korea. And what had started as just a conflict between two Korean governments had become an international war. And for 3 years, the fighting continued. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Entire cities were destroyed and wiped out, and countless families were separated, some never seen each other again. Then in 1953, the fighting finally stopped. But here's the part many people don't know. You see, the war never officially ended because the two sides signed an armistice. And an armistice is basically just like a ceasefire, not a peace treaty, which means that technically North Korea and South Korea are still at war today. The border remained exactly where it has started, but now it wasn't just a map, or it wasn't just a line on a map anymore. It has now become one of the most heavily guarded borders on earth today. A place where two people who shared the same history would begin living two completely different lives. And that's when the real difference between North Korea and South Korea actually began. So when the war ended, North Korea and South Korea were both left in ruins. I mean, they had destroyed cities, families were separated, millions of people had lost everything. And in many ways, you can say that they were both basically starting from the same point, or almost the same point again. I mean, they both had destroyed cities and stuff. But over the next 70 years, the two countries began moving in completely different directions. South Korea opened itself to the world, and because of that, businesses grew, factories were built, technology became part of everyday life. And companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG didn't just become successful in Korea, but they became global brands. And even Korean music, movies, and TV shows found fans all over the world. And today, millions of people watch K-dramas, listen to K-pop, and use products made by Korean companies without even thinking about it. Meanwhile, North Korea chose a very different path. The country became increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. Access to outside information became heavily restricted, and traveling in and out of the country became extremely difficult. The government focused heavily on just the military, while the rest of the country's economy remained cut off from the rest of the world. And slowly, the gap between these two countries became almost impossible to ignore. I mean, one of them became one of Asia's biggest economies, while the other remained one of the world's most isolated nations. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. Will North Korea and South Korea ever become one again, or has too much time already passed? Leave your answer in the comments below. So, will North Korea and South Korea ever become one country again? Well, the truth is that nobody actually knows. You see, over the years, there have been meetings between the leaders of the two countries, moments of hope, conversations about peace, but the border is still there. And for millions of people, it is the only Korea they had ever known. Today, there are people living in North Korea who had never stepped foot in the South, and there are people living in South Korea who had never even seen the North with their own eyes. And even an entire generation has grown up only knowing one side of the border, which makes this story much more bigger than just politics. It is about how one decision, one war, one line drawn across a country changed the lives of millions of ordinary people. Because if history had gone differently, or just slightly gone differently, the two Koreas we know today might not even exist. And maybe that is the biggest lesson this story teaches us, because history isn't just something we read about in books. It is something that decides where we are born, the opportunities we have, the information we grow up with, and even the futures we are able to imagine. Two countries, one people, two completely different worlds. And it all started with just one line drawn across a country. My name is Remy, and if you enjoyed this documentary, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you are feeling generous today, maybe just a little bit too generous, go ahead and hit the like button as well. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.